If you were looking for reasons to be optimistic about the future of higher education, or HE, in England, the last academic year was a rather disappointing spectacle. The inflation-linked rise in tuition fees towards the end of 2024 was swallowed up by the simultaneous increase in national insurance costs for employers, including HE providers, while this summer's spending review across all government departments offered no solutions to the sector's funding woes. In contrast, this academic year has started with HE in the news for a more positive reason, with the announcement on September the 10th that the University of Greenwich and the University of Kent intended to formally collaborate to create a new super university, provisionally titled the London and South East University Group. So what is this new university group, and what is it trying to achieve? Could other universities be tempted to follow suit by setting up their own group-like structures? And is the notion of a university group the future of HE in this country, or merely a distraction? My guests are David Kernahan, the Deputy Editor of Wonky, a higher education news site, and Rachel Hewitt, the Chief Executive at Million Plus, the Association for Modern Universities. I'm Tom Richmond, and to discover how super this new super university is likely to be, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
Talking about groups of education providers working together is something that is very common in some parts of our education system. We have thousands of schools working together in multi-academy trusts. In the further education sector, they're very used to seeing institutions merge and set up group-like structures. But such formal collaborations between institutions are not necessarily something that I would associate with the HE sector, at least not to the same extent. David, is there much precedent in HE for institutions deciding that they would in fact be better off joining forces with other organisations?
Well, I mean, the entire history of higher education institutions is a history of mergers. If you go back right to the early days of Oxford or Bologna, it started off individual academics who had effectively their own businesses all coming together to share common core services. If you read the About Us page on any university website, which is the best page on any university website, you will learn about the way that various Victorian colleges have come together and are taking bits of themselves and bits of other things to create a university. You will learn about the way stuff like teacher training colleges and nursing schools have been merged into universities over the year. And there's a strong track record of actual institutions that have come together to be one larger university. I mean, I think of, say, the University of South Wales, which is made up of the old University of Glamorgan, the University College Wales in Newport, and the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama. We can talk about Manchester and the old UMIST. I mean, even recently, City St George's University of London, a very old medical school and a very prestigious modern university in City University coming together. And that's even ignoring the fact that, universities already work together in lots of ways, even though they have different names. They share a common admissions service in UCAS. They share large chunks of a common information technology and connectivity service in JISC. It goes on and on, really. The history of higher education is the history of collaboration.
Fascinating. Thank you, David. That's a very useful bit of context for our conversation today. Rachel, having scoured the media coverage in recent days that I've seen about the announcement by Kent and Greenwich, I've seen it described as a merger, a takeover, a group, and a super university. So, first things first, what exactly have these universities announced?
From what we know of what's been publicly announced so far, The super university, if we want to use that terminology, is going to involve bringing both institutions together under the London and South East University Group. And they're describing that as one structure, but something that allows each university to retain its identity, its name, and its local presence. So in terms of the setup, that will have one governing body across the university group, one academic board, one executive team, one vice-chancellor. But the intention is that students still experience them as individual institutions. So a student will still apply to either University of Kent or Greenwich. They'll still study at that institution and they'll still be a graduate of either University of Kent or Greenwich. So from a kind of student-facing perspective, they're still seen as distinct. But from an institutional perspective, various operations will come under the group itself. That's what we do know. I guess in terms of what we don't know, there's still quite a lot to figure out and quite a lot to learn about the university group. We don't yet know how it'll work exactly in terms of university regulation, what it'll mean in terms of the kind of operation of professional services across the university group, whether it'll mean any changes to the academic portfolio. So I think there's still a lot of questions to be answered and to be seen about how that plays out in coming months.
Okay, so that's what we know and don't know about what Kent and Greenwich have announced. So let's turn our attention to the implications of this fascinating development in HE. Inevitably, given the cost pressures that many providers say they are facing at the moment, there was some speculation that this new university group was really about saving money. According to the BBC, the vice-chancellors of both universities insisted the move was not driven by a financial crisis for either institution, although they did argue that this new university model would be, quote, resilient and financially viable. David, as an experienced HE journalist who has had to read between the lines of many press releases from universities over the years, do you think that ultimately this merger was probably about saving money more than anything else?
Well, the first thing to think about with any merger is it's not a means of saving money in the short term. You don't immediately save money by saying, oh, we're going to merge everything. Because obviously there's costs associated to mergers. I mean, you start even with something as daft as coming up with a new brand, a new visual identity. But as you start to merge two institutions, you have to merge a set of assumptions and a set of processes. And it is these assumptions and processes that take the time and the money. A great example would be a student record system. Every single university needs to keep information regarding the students they have registered, what they're doing, what they're up to, and ideally what degree they're going to get. This is done slightly differently in every university and often slightly differently in different parts of the same university. There's a lot of different kind of data needs. There's a lot of different understandings and assumptions that are baked into processes. If you're going to start merging, you'd think, okay, we're going to go into a single process. First thing you have to do is you have to understand your own existing processes. That sounds simple and straightforward. In practice, it's a lot of time, a lot of money just to get everything working in a single institution in a way that you can optimize it. Add in a layer of complexity. You've got the extra institution that you need to merge into these processes. You're looking at a big spend. And this is across nearly every aspect of what a university does. So in the short term, it will cost money. Possibly in the longer term, it will save money. There will be direct savings, optimization savings. You're also looking at savings if you've got a duplication of provision rather than marketing and running two courses in, say, chemistry. You would bring them together into one course and there's potentially saving there. But even there, you look in 3-5 years down the line before you start seeing any comeback on that. So, as the press releases say, in that this is not a way of saving money. This is, I think, is being done for strategic reasons, with a possible longer-term view to being more efficient. But if the strategic fit wasn't there, it absolutely would not be worth doing.
Rachel, what do you make of the money side of this? If we did see, for the sake of argument, more mergers and more group-like structures starting to appear because of the financial pressures that the sector is under, would that necessarily be a bad thing? Isn't it quite rational for HE providers and other education providers to be thinking about how they might make themselves more resilient?
Yeah, I think as David's really clearly set out, I think the challenge is that sometimes these things are immediately seen as a way to suddenly free up a lot of cash, and I don't think that is the case. I don't think any savings come in for quite some time. So I think the danger would be if institutions saw something like this happening and saw that as a way of just wholly saving money. I think that's a dangerous starting point because there's no guarantee of quick returns. But I do think the point around the kind of strategic direction that institutions may want to take, the efficiencies that institutions are looking to make overall, I think this is one way of exploring that avenue. I think institutions, as we all know, are having an incredibly difficult financial time with the increasing costs in recent years, declining unit of resource and damaging policy changes that we've seen. And I think universities are taking this incredibly seriously. I work with a lot of vice-chancellors who are working really hard to balance the books in a tight financial climate. So, I think clearly institutions need to find ways of making efficiencies, and collaboration opportunities are one avenue of exploring efficiency savings, but probably not a quick gain, but a longer strategic plan, I guess.
Well, as you say, I'm sure many vice-chancellors around the country have been watching what's been happening at Kent and Greenwich with a great deal of interest too. But I guess for me, from a policy perspective, that raises quite an interesting question as to whether other institutions can learn much, if anything, by monitoring these developments at Greenwich and Kent, because these universities are in fact building on an existing relationship. So, for example, we saw in some of the press coverage that they already share a campus in Medway, where the universities have been working together for over 20 years. And this shared campus sits almost exactly halfway between Kent's other campus and the main Greenwich campus. So, Rachel, how much do you think other institutions can realistically learn from this quite innovative partnership that's being set up? Do you think there are maybe good reasons to be cautious about other institutions trying to copy what they're seeing?
Yeah, I think it's obviously going to be something that's watched closely across the sector to see how this develops. But I think actually there's a lot of thinking along these kind of lines going on already in the sector. And different institutions will take different approaches to the types of opportunities around collaboration and working together. I think we do have to recognise that different things will work in different contexts. So we as a mission group represent institutions which have quite a wide geographical spread across the country, different size institutions, and who all have unique local contexts which need to be taken into account in thinking about any collaboration opportunities or steps forward. But as I say, I think there's lots of thinking going on across the sector around this. So we're working closely with our member universities on a project around transformation, efficiency and collaboration. And that's raising opportunities for universities to share intelligence about change that's already underway in their own institutions, explore opportunities for collaboration and benefit from collective learning about things going on. And that's been a really positive opportunity for universities to work with other universities across our membership who share the same missions and values as them. And one of the things that we found interesting through that is it doesn't necessarily need to involve them being located in the same place. In some cases, it's easier to work with an institution who's similar in type to you than an institution who's just down the road, particularly in the environment we're working in now. So I think people will watch closely to see what happens next with this example. But I think actually there's a lot of examples of collaboration and transformation opportunities going on across the sector that may just not all be surfaced yet at this stage.
David, I saw in one of your recent articles the two universities had described their union as, quote, a blueprint for other institutions to follow. What do you make of that claim? Even if other institutions did want to copy Kent and Greenwich, do you think they're likely to succeed in doing so?
It is certainly, as Rachel says, this is something that a lot of institutions up and down the country are keeping a very close eye on. It was a big surprise, I think, to a lot of people when it was announced. We've not seen this level of, it is a merger. I know the press releases initially did shy away from using the term, it is a merger. We've not seen something happen quite like this before in HE in recent times. It is kind of a special case in that these are two institutions that are already collaborating closely together. They've been running the Medway School of Pharmacy for a number of years. It is notable, and I think a few people have picked up on the fact that that campus is also shared by Canterbury Christ Church University. another local university who must be looking particularly closely at two of their other collaborators on that particular campus, entering into what we might describe as an ever closer union. So in terms of this being a blueprint, the problem comes in that there is not really a blueprint. In many ways, this kind of structure, having two separate student-facing universities, student-facing brands, if you will, that also have a common governance structure and I imagine eventually common student services, a common back office stuff, common data models. It's not really being done. There are a lot of really interesting regulatory questions about stuff like university title, about stuff like degree awarding powers that haven't quite been bottomed out. We've seen initially from the Office for Students that they're prepared to work constructively with this, but there's not really any rules and regulations that set out the way that this will work in terms of regulation, in the terms of how it will interface with stuff like the Office for Students, with the Student Loans Company, with the Research Excellence Framework. It's a story that is yet to be written for these institutions, and a thing that other Vice-Chancellors who are watching this will be paying close attention to is the flexibility afforded within existing structures to make this actually possible to happen without too much pain.
Well, you mentioned this point around university title. It would be great if you could talk our listeners through why this might be quite a sticky issue, because as I understand it, the word university is protected. So you can't have anybody who's sticking their hand up and calling themselves a university. And yet here we are with Kent and Greenwich setting up the London and South East University Group. So what exactly are the potential implications of a new group calling itself a university group when the university title is protected?
This is the kind of question that I absolutely love digging into, and I apologise in advance for being an absolutely massive nerd about it. It's just utterly fascinating. So, as you say, the word university is a protected term at Companies House. I could not randomly set up a company that had the word university in without permission from Companies House. In practice, if somebody rocks up to Companies House and asks about this, they're going to ask the Department for Education. The Department for Education outsources a lot of this decision, a lot of the legwork to the Office for Students, our regulator. There is a documented university title process that you go through at the Office for Students, which then makes the recommendation. In the bad old days, this used to be done via the Privy Council or via an individual act of Parliament. Now, the two universities involved in this merger, the University of Kent and the University of Greenwich, have both already got university title by different means. The University of Kent went via the Privy Council. The University of Greenwich, this was done by the Further and Higher Education Act 1992. So they both have got university title to call themselves the University of Greenwich, University of Kent. Now, in the press release, you get the sense this is going to be a new company that these two are going to be slightly merged into and managed by. That new company will not have university title. It will need to apply for it. Now, you would think the Office for Students would wave it through, but we don't really know exactly the implications for how this will happen, how this will be done. There may be an application process. There may be a number of checks around the governance structures that need to be done before this can be awarded. So it's not necessarily cut and dry whether you can call this particular university group a university group. And if you can, university title is always only awarded to an actual organisation. You can't award it to a brand. So that, again, is something that's going to need to be discussed. If they want to keep the University of Greenwich as a brand, are they allowed to do that? We don't know, and it's going to be really fascinating to get into the nitty-gritty of whether this is something that's going to happen easily or straightforwardly, or is something that is going to be an administrative nightmare.
We shall wait and see. Yes, one of many things that we're still waiting for a bit of clarity on, but it's definitely one to watch. Okay, this blueprint point, there's another angle that I wanted to pick up on here, because it's going to be really interesting to see whether this idea of mergers and groups features in the government's strategy for post-16 education, which is due to be published later this year and will presumably include schools, colleges and apprenticeships as well as HE. Winding back to the 2024 Labour election manifesto, it talked about their desire in this upcoming strategy to, quote, better integrate further and higher education and ensure high quality teaching, which will apparently, quote, set out the role for different providers and how students can move between institutions. The manifesto also wanted to, quote, act to improve access to universities and raise teaching standards. So there's a lot of ambitions in there that could affect the HE sector, although manifestos are, of course, always prone to putting ambition ahead of implementation. Rachel, when you look at that shopping list of ideas for post-16 education that we saw last year from the Labour Party, and we may see in this upcoming strategy too, do you see a potential role for university groups as opposed to individual universities in achieving some of those goals?
Yes, I think it's an interesting one because I think if we're talking about, improving access, raising teaching standards, a university group could help to achieve that, but there's not really a clear reason why it would be better able to achieve that than individual institutions. But I think what is going to be interesting to see from the post-16 skills strategy is we're expecting partnerships to be a kind of big part of their thinking around that. Now, that might be partnerships between higher and further education, but also presumably partnerships across higher education. And I think in order to see that made a success, I think what we need to see from government is thinking about how they can incentivise the behaviours that they want to see around that. If they want to see more work done around access or teaching standards or partnerships, how can that be incentivised? So, for example, for some of the reasons that David set out, the relatively rigid regulatory system can stifle innovation within higher education. For example, it's much easier through the system to take a very traditional student than a student with more complex or from a more complex background in terms of regulatory guidance around that. So how can the government think around setting up the system so it incentivises the type of things they want to see around partnerships, around access, around teaching quality? And as David says, it will be very interesting to see how the Department for Education and the OFS work with Greenwich and Kent with the current example we have before that paper comes out on regulation, when we get into some of the weeds of the practicalities about how that can actually be delivered.
David, do you think the government would be wise to look at university groups to help them achieve these broader goals in post-16 education, or are discussions of mergers and groups a bit of a distraction at the moment, do you think?
Well, I mean, the government can be in favour of anything it likes. The fact remains universities are autonomous organisations. It would be an interesting breach of competition law if the government was to say, OK, we need to bring you all together in groups. You can't really do that. So the government might recommend towards it. A thing it would need to do was to put incentives in place or to make regulatory changes in order to make it easier and more straightforward for universities to come together in this way. I suspect there's a lot more savings to be done with procurement. I think a thing I might look for in the white paper is a change to the rules on value-added tax involving group procurement, allowing universities to get together and buy things for cheaper. I would see maybe recommendations around shared services. I mean, as we said at the top of the programme, there are some really good examples of this, stuff like the way you apply to university via UCAS. There has to be scope maybe to do something similar to that, but for postgraduate applications. That would maybe save universities a lot of time and money and make things easier for students. We've got collaborations on all kinds of things relating to technology and data via JISC. There are ways in which that could potentially be expanded if every single university needs to buy a particular kind of software. As happens in many cases already, couldn't the sector come together and get this a bit cheaper? The same comes with academic publication and journal article deals. Thinking slightly more radically, maybe changes to the rules of stuff like the Research Excellence Framework, which is based on articles published in traditional academic journals, which is a really expensive thing to do, and universities spend a lot of money on doing things like this. Perhaps the ref could be addressed in a different way that didn't actually involve that kind of formal publication and looked at more modern things like information repositories or preprint servers or stuff like that. A role maybe for the whole sector working together on different models of academic publications. So despite the fact the government cannot force universities to work together, it can put a lot of incentives in place to make it easier for them to do so if they want to. And it can also look at ways it could facilitate regulation to help universities to stay autonomous and still act together to save money and to make things easier for students.
Okay, so maybe some options for the sector and for government there too. We shall find out later this year, I'm sure. Okay, we are approaching the end of this episode, so it's time for one last question from me. This merger between Kent and Greenwich to form the provisionally titled London and South East University Group is a very interesting development at a time when the future of the HE sector remains uncertain, both within this Parliament and certainly beyond this Parliament too after the next election. But I think we can say with some confidence that the financial pressures facing HE providers are not going away, even if a bit more money does materialise in the short term, for example through another inflation-linked rise in tuition fees. So if the financial strain is almost certainly here to stay, mergers and new groups could become an increasingly common sight in the HE sector. But my question is, would that be a good thing in your view? Would you welcome a future HE sector that has fewer standalone institutions and more group structures? Rachel, would you be pleased to see an HE sector move towards more mergers and groups in future?
I think our higher education system definitely needs to keep adapting to meet future needs. And I think there's quite a lot of thinking going on around this in terms of different ways of operating and meeting different student needs for the future and those sorts of things. And I think university groups is one way of doing this, but I certainly don't think it's the only way of innovating and delivering for the future. So in terms of what I'd like to see, as well as that kind of ongoing innovation and thinking, which could involve university groups, I think I have to say that I'd like to see a system that's more strategically prioritised in terms of its role for growth and meeting the opportunity mission and having that sort of broader support to become financially sustainable as well. But that's probably my long wish list.
Thank you, Rachel. David, is the prospect of more university groups something that you would be happy to embrace?
Well, it is really at heart a question of what you actually value about a university. I like universities because they teach students. I like universities because they perform research. I like universities because they contribute to the local economy and they can drive innovation, drive exploration, discover new things. Universities are pretty fantastic when it comes down to it. As to caring especially what they're called or where they are or what the campus looks like or if they've got 2 vice-chancellors or 1 vice-chancellor or if they're sharing a student data model, I'm prepared to be pragmatic about that. If stuff like this helps to preserve the good work that universities actually do, it would be strange to be hung up on their names or their identity or their corporate structure, really. There's always going to be innovation. There always has been innovation in the university sector. There's lots of things that potentially could happen. An example of this is the current growth of franchise and academic partnerships, which at their best allow universities to serve underserved spots around the UK and even further afield. But obviously there are issues with that and quality and standards. Universities will try and do new things because they're innovative organisations. Regulations will catch up to make sure there's no unintended consequences. So, providing we manage to get the funding model sorted out, I feel quietly confident that the future of universities will at least be interesting, even if the complete kind of Pokemon deck of universities that we have now is not necessarily looking exactly the same in the future.
Thank you, David. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Rachel and David for explaining and indeed exploring what has been described as the UK's first super university. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.